Before the formation of the Canadian state, the North American interior was a complex network of sovereign indigenous nations. When 17th-century French Jesuit missionaries arrived in Wendake, they entered a space where they had neither the numbers nor the power to force compliance. Instead, what unfolded was a period of rigorous philosophical exchange. Indigenous systems of education and metaphysics were already deeply established. Village elders and spiritual practitioners debated the mysteries of life, death, and the afterlife with the university-educated Jesuits on equal intellectual footing. The Wendat scrutinized Catholic beliefs with an intellectual curiosity, selectively adopting and adapting only the elements that made sense within their own complex worldviews. In these early decades, the Canadian wilderness was a site of sophisticated metaphysical debate between cultures that recognized each other's intellectual capacity. 2 centuries later, the balance of power shifted. By the 1860s, colonial elites were orchestrating the Confederation project, drawing up the broad outlines of a new nation. Throughout these negotiations, First Nations were entirely shut out. There was no consultation regarding their concerns, and their future position within the new federation was ignored in public discussion. Instead, the terms of the relationship were dictated unilaterally. When Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, addressed Parliament, he outlined a starkly different approach to Indigenous populations. Macdonald explicitly stated that it would be the state's goal, quote, to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the inhabitants of the Dominion. At the exact moment the Canadian state was born, its leadership codified a clear objective. Nation-building required the systemic eradication of the original inhabitants' cultures and belief systems. The primary mechanism for this erasure was the law. In 1876, the government passed the Indian Act. It bypassed the massive diversity of Indigenous groups, applying a blanket policy that legally reduced autonomous peoples to wards of the state. Existing structures of community governance were dismantled. The state actively ignored or abolished hereditary leadership, replacing it with artificial, local elections closely overseen by federal Indian agents. The state then moved to criminalize cultural expression itself. Practices like the potlatch were officially banned in 1884. To the colonial government, these ceremonies offended capitalist and Christian values of thrift, private property, and wealth accumulation. The enforcement of these bans was aggressive. In 1922, Namgis chief Dan Cranmer hosted a massive potlatch in Kwakwakwa territory. An alert Indian agent ensured the gathering was raided by the provincial police. Dozens of men and women were handed jail sentences of up to 3 months simply for participating. Furthermore, police seized a vast amount of privately owned cultural property, masks, regalia, and carved figures, selling them off to collectors and museums. Through the Indian Act, the Canadian state weaponized the legal code to dismantle the specific rituals and institutions that maintained the economic and social cohesion of Indigenous nations. Laws targeting adults could only accomplish so much. To achieve total assimilation, the state recognized it had to sever the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. They needed to target the children. Macdonald argued that children living with their parents were surrounded by savages, retaining Indigenous habits and modes of thought. The stated solution was to physically remove children from parental influence and isolate them in central training facilities. This led to the creation of the residential school system. Over 130 of these large, imposing brick and stone structures were built across the country, designed to warehouse and transform over 150,000 Indigenous children. Inside, the institutions were severely underfunded. To reduce operating costs, the schools relied heavily on Gruen child labor. Students spent half their day working in fields or mopping floors, while suffering from chronic malnutrition. The physical conditions were lethal. Overcrowded dormitories and severe neglect created a breeding ground for disease. In some facilities, tuberculosis claimed the lives of up to 60% of the student population. By the mid-20th century, this system was aggressively expanded into the Arctic to isolate Inuit youth in massive hostel schools, while parallel, similarly destructive provincial systems were utilized to marginalize Métis children. The residential school system functioned as a mechanism for cultural genocide. targeting children with the explicit goal of severing ancestral ties through institutional trauma. As the enormous educational and moral failures of the residential schools became impossible to ignore in the mid-20th century, they began to close. But the state did not abandon its objective, it merely adapted its tactics. Responsibility shifted to provincial child welfare authorities in what became known as the 60s Scoop. Social workers, backed by police, began mass apprehensions of Indigenous children, removing them from their homes under the official guise of acting in the children's best interests. These children were placed almost exclusively with non-Indigenous families, and some were exported to the United States. The secular authorities successfully perpetuated the same alienation from community and culture that the church-run schools had started. Yet, despite a century of persecution, total erasure failed. Indigenous communities quietly protected their ceremonies, practicing the potlatch and the sundance underground, and survived the institutions designed to break them. In the 1990s, a long overdue public reckoning began. Leaders like Phil Fontaine bravely stepped forward to disclose the systemic sexual, physical, and psychological abuse, breaking the silence and forcing the government to acknowledge the atrocities. The deep, enduring trauma experienced within Indigenous communities today is not an accident of history or a byproduct of good intentions gone awry. It is the direct, intended consequence of a state that spent over a century meticulously engineering the destruction of its original peoples.